The feed store called it a seasonal adjustment. That's a polite way of saying the price went up again. You load the truck anyway. £50 here, 80 there, because the animals don't care what it costs. They just need to eat. And this isn't a one-time expense. It's every second week, sometimes every week, from the first hard frost until the grass finally comes back in spring. Multiply that by however many animals you're keeping, and by however many months of real winter you get, and the number stops being an annoyance and starts being something you actually budget around every single year. You start doing the math in your head, what this actually adds up to by March, and you stop because you don't really want to know the answer. Now picture something else. A farmer walks past that same stack of feed bags. His animals are already eating. Not from a bag, not from anything he bought this month or even this year. He planted it, back in the spring, when nobody else was thinking about winter at all. Then he mostly left it alone. What are they eating? I'm not going to tell you yet. Because the crop itself isn't really the interesting part of this story. What's interesting is why so many farmers stopped growing it, and why a growing number are starting to plant it again. It's a root crop that used to be common on farms across America, Britain, Canada, and Australia. And then, for reasons that had more to do with convenience than with quality, it almost disappeared. I'm Jeremiah Stone, and today I want to walk you through what it is, why it worked, where it actually falls short, and how you could realistically try it yourself. Because I'm not going to stand here and tell you it'll make your feed bill vanish. It won't. But it can do more than most people give it credit for. If you've ever done that math on the truck ride home from the feed store, this next part matters to you. Before we go further, hit subscribe, because I'll be building on this one in a future video, and I don't want you to miss the follow-up. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how many climates we're actually talking to today. Now, back to the field. Older farmers called it the Mangel, or Mangel Wurzel. Some called it Fodder beet. It's a root crop, a cousin of the beet you'd recognize from a garden, but bred over generations for size and yield rather than taste. It was one of the most important winter forage crops in Britain by the 1700s, and it crossed the Atlantic with settlers who needed something that could survive a real winter and still put weight on livestock when the ground was frozen solid. Some varieties can grow to the size of a large melon. That's not an exaggeration for effect. That's the actual reason farmers valued it. One root could weigh several pounds, and a modest patch could produce a serious volume of forage. So why did something this useful nearly vanish? Not because it stopped working. Once cheap, bagged, shelf-stable feed became widely available through the middle of the last century, a lot of labour-intensive traditional crops lost their place on the farm. Not because farmers discovered they were inferior, but because buying feed became easier than growing and storing it yourself. Convenience won the argument. Whether it was the right trade is a separate question, and it's one more farmers are starting to ask again, as that convenience keeps getting more expensive. Here's what actually made mangels worth the labour. They're biennial root vegetables, which means in their first year, the only year that matters for feed, they pour almost all their energy into building one large, dense root instead of going to seed. They tolerate cooler soil better than most vegetable crops, and depending on variety and climate, they can stay in the ground later into the season than you'd expect from something that looks so much like a garden vegetable on top. That's the first thing worth sitting with. A plant that looks fragile above ground can be remarkably tough underground. But there's a second, quieter reason this crop earned its place on old farms, and I'm going to come back to it later. because it has almost nothing to do with feeding animals at all. Growing a big root isn't the whole story, though. The real advantage shows up after harvest, because unlike leafy forage, fodder beet stores. Properly cured and kept in a cool, frost-protected space. A root cellar, a clamp, an unheated shed, a straw-insulated outdoor pile, depending on your climate, mangels can hold well into winter. That single fact is why this crop mattered so much to farmers before refrigeration and before feed mills existed at all. It let a farmer turn one growing season into months of usable forage sitting in reserve. There's a mistake most beginners make here, and I'll tell you about it. But not yet, because you need to understand the sugar problem first. And that mistake and that problem are connected. Fodder beet is not a complete diet, and this is the part I want you to actually remember. It's high in energy, mostly from natural sugars stored in the root, but it's relatively low in protein, and it doesn't substitute for the fiber livestock get from hay, pasture, or silage. Feed it as the entire ration, and you create problems instead of solving them. It's a supplement, a genuinely valuable one, but a supplement, not a replacement. Now here's that beginner mistake I mentioned. The first time I grew a serious patch of mangels, I assumed bigger roots were simply better, and I let too many of them grow oversized without proper spacing or thinning. Bigger roots take longer to cure, they're more prone to rot in storage, and because of that sugar concentration, they're also easier to overfeed by accident if you're not paying attention to portion. Spacing, thinning, and a slow introduction to the animal's diet all matter more than most first-time growers expect. That's the detail that gets left out of the exciting version of this story. That sugar and fiber distinction is actually the turning point in how you should think about this whole idea. This was never really about one miracle crop replacing a feed bag. It's about a farm producing part of its own forage instead of buying every single pound of it. Older farmers weren't trying to eliminate purchased feed entirely. Many still bought grain or hay to balance the ration properly. What they were doing was reducing how much they depended on the feed store and building a little resilience into a system that didn't collapse the moment prices climbed. That's a different promise than never pay for feed again. It's a smaller promise, but it's an honest one. There's also a climate reality worth being upfront about. If you're in the northern US or much of Canada, mangels are typically planted after the last hard frost in spring and pulled in autumn before the ground locks up. And your storage window through a genuinely cold winter tends to be generous. In the UK, wetter conditions mean drainage matters as much as cold tolerance. Waterlogged storage will rot a crop faster than frost ever will. In milder parts of the southern US, and in much of Australia, your growing calendar shifts earlier, and your effective cold storage window is shorter, since the crop's winter-holding advantage depends on genuinely cool storage conditions, not just cool growing conditions. The underlying principle, grow it in the warm season, store it through the cold one, holds everywhere. The exact calendar doesn't. So how would you actually start? Choose a spot with deep, loosened soil, since these roots need room to expand downward. Compacted or rocky ground will stunt them and turn harvest into a fight. Seeds go in after your last frost date, spaced generously, because crowding is exactly the mistake I described earlier. Water consistently while the roots are establishing themselves. Once mature, mangels tolerate drier conditions reasonably well, though yield will reflect however much stress the plant went through along the way. In that first year, don't expect a perfect result. Expect to learn how this specific variety behaves in your specific soil, because that knowledge is worth more than the harvest itself. By autumn, Before a hard freeze locks the ground, you harvest, trim the tops, and let the roots cure somewhere cool and dry for a short period before moving them into longer-term storage. And here's a detail that surprises a lot of new growers. You don't feed mangels to livestock immediately after harvest. Freshly pulled roots benefit from that curing period, and any new feed this rich in natural sugar needs to be introduced gradually. A modest amount, alongside the animal's normal ration, increased slowly while you watch how they respond. Too much, too fast, is a real risk with any high-sugar root crop, especially for animals with sensitive digestion. Cattle and sheep have traditionally been the main beneficiaries, since their digestive systems handle a fibrous, high-volume forage supplement well. Pigs have historically been fed fodder beet in some regions too. Horses need far more caution because of their sensitivity to sudden sugar intake. So if you're considering this for horses specifically, that's a conversation to have with someone who knows your animal, not an instruction to take from a video. Now, the piece I said I'd come back to. The quieter reason old farms kept growing root crops like this wasn't only about feed. Grown in rotation with pasture or grain, those large roots push down and help break up compacted soil layers as they grow. Many traditional farms used mangels specifically as a rotational crop for that reason, not just for the forage value. So even in a year where you don't end up needing every root for feed, the ground itself comes out better for having grown them. And here's the storage method that actually made this whole system work, the one I promised earlier. Farmers didn't need anything sophisticated. A simple outdoor clamp, a layered pile of roots insulated with straw and topped with soil, built in a spot with decent drainage, could hold a harvest through most of a cold season using nothing but materials already on the farm. Where winters were milder or wetter, an unheated shed or root cellar did the same job. It's not glamorous, and it takes an afternoon to build properly. But that simple structure is what turned one autumn harvest into a genuine winter-long resource instead of a pile of roots that spoiled by December. Which brings me to the honest part, the part that actually determines whether you trust anything else I've told you today. This crop will not replace your feed bill, and it will not eliminate your dependence on hay, pasture, or a balanced ration. If anyone tells you it does, they're selling you something rather than teaching you something. As for feeding them all winter, that depends entirely on scale. Grow enough roots, store them properly, and use them as the supplement they're meant to be. And yes, a well-managed patch can realistically stretch across most or all of a feeding season for a small herd. Grow a token patch and expect it to carry a large operation through, and you'll run out well before spring. The crop can do a lot. It can't do everything, and it can't do it without enough ground behind it. Older farmers understood something that got lost when feed became something you simply drove into town and bought. A farm can be designed to provide part of what it needs, instead of depending entirely on outside inputs. That's not nostalgia. It's a genuinely different way of thinking about the whole operation. If you want to start small, here's the realistic first step. Don't convert half your field to fodder beet this year. Plant a short test row, learn how the variety behaves in your soil and your climate, and get comfortable with curing and storage before you scale anything up. Every farmer who's used this crop successfully learned it in that order, not the other way around. There's still one thing I haven't told you. How much ground it actually takes to feed a given number of animals through a real winter. And that number changes more than you'd think depending on what else is in the ration. That's a harder question than it sounds, and it's worth its own video. Until then, subscribe if you want to see that one when it's out, And tell me down in the comments where you're watching from, and whether your family ever grew something like this before it quietly disappeared from most modern farms. I'd like to know how far this old habit actually travelled,